In the dusty training grounds of Fort Braxton, where the morning sun cast long shadows across the obstacle course, nobody expected that a single moment of courage would shatter more than just bones. They say that true strength isn't measured by how hard you can hit, but by how you stand when someone tries to knock you down. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had spent 3 years proving herself in a world where being a woman in the infantry meant fighting two battles, one against the enemy and another against those who believed she didn't belong. But on this particular Tuesday morning, when Captain Derek Mitchell decided to make an example out of her in front of the entire platoon, he had no idea he was about to discover what happens when you corner a soldier who has nothing left to lose. What started as routine combat training would end with ambulance sirens, a shattered career, and a courtroom battle that would expose the dark underbelly of military harassment. This isn't just a story about one woman's fight for respect. It's about the moment when standing your ground becomes the most dangerous thing you can do. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried under years of silence and intimidation. And sometimes it takes just one person refusing to back down to change everything. Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she checked her watch. 5:30 in the morning at Fort Braxton meant the desert air was still cool, but she knew that would change quickly. She had been awake since 4, going through her morning routine of push-ups, sit-ups, and a 3-mile run around the base perimeter. It wasn't required, but Maria had learned long ago that being average wasn't enough when you were one of only 12 women in an infantry battalion of 300 soldiers. The mess hall buzzed with the usual morning chatter as Maria grabbed her tray and moved through the line. She could feel eyes on her as she walked past tables of male soldiers, some nodding respectfully, others looking away quickly. After 3 years at Fort Braxton, she had earned her place through sweat, blood, and sheer determination. She had graduated top of her class from basic training, scored expert marksman on every weapons qualification, and had never failed a physical fitness test. But Captain Derek Mitchell still treated her like she was a tourist visiting his army. Maria found an empty table near the window and sat down with her breakfast. She pulled out a worn notebook and began reviewing the training schedule for the day. Hand-to-hand combat training was scheduled for 0800 hours, followed by weapons maintenance and tactical exercises. It was supposed to be a routine Tuesday, but something in the air felt different. "Mind if we sit here, Santos?" Maria looked up to see Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez approaching with his tray, followed by 3 other soldiers from her squad. Rodriguez was one of the few soldiers who had accepted her from day one, treating her as an equal rather than a curiosity. "Course not," Maria said, closing her notebook. "You guys ready for Mitchell's circus today?" Private Johnson, barely 19 and still adjusting to military life, looked nervous. "What do you mean?" "She means our beloved captain likes to put on a show during training," explained Corporal Williams, a veteran of 2 deployments who had seen his share of difficult commanders. "Especially when there's an audience." Maria nodded grimly. Word had spread that Colonel Harris would be observing training exercises today, along with several visiting officers from other bases. Captain Mitchell always became more aggressive when higher-ups were watching, and Maria had learned to be extra cautious during those times. "Just keep your heads down and follow protocol," Rodriguez advised. "Don't give him any reason to single you out." But Maria knew that advice didn't apply to her. Captain Mitchell didn't need a reason to single her out. Her mere presence seemed to irritate him, as if her success was somehow a personal insult to his authority. The conversation was interrupted by the sharp sound of boots on the mess hall floor. Captain Mitchell entered with his usual swagger, his uniform pressed to perfection and his expression already set in its customary scowl. He was a large man, standing 6 feet 4 inches and weighing at least 230 pounds. He had played football in college before joining the Army, and he carried himself like someone who was used to being the biggest person in any room. Mitchell's eyes swept across the mess hall until they landed on Maria's table. He stared for a moment longer than necessary before moving on, but the message was clear. Today was going to be one of those days. "All right, people, listen up." Mitchell's voice boomed across the mess hall. "Training starts at 0800 sharp. We got important visitors today, so I expect everyone to be at their absolute best. That means no mistakes, no excuses, and no embarrassing our unit." His eyes found Maria again. "Some of you might think you've earned the right to coast, but let me remind you that in my army, you're only as good as your last performance. And if your last performance wasn't up to standard, today's your chance to prove you belong here. The mess hall fell silent. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about, even though Maria's performance had been exemplary for months. She had led her squad to victory in the last 3 training competitions, earned commendations for her leadership during field exercises, and had been recommended for promotion by every supervisor except Mitchell. Maria felt her jaw clench, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned not to react to Mitchell's provocations, knowing that any response would only make things worse. Instead, she finished her breakfast in silence while her squad mates exchanged worried glances. After breakfast, Maria returned to her barracks to prepare for training. She carefully inspected her gear, checking every buckle, strap, and piece of equipment. She knew that Mitchell would be looking for any excuse to criticize her, so everything had to be perfect. Her roommate, Specialist Lisa Chun, was getting ready for her duties in the communications center. Chun was one of the few people on base that Maria could talk to openly about the challenges she faced. "How are you holding up?" Chun asked, noticing Maria's tense expression. "Same as always," Maria replied, adjusting her tactical vest. "Mitchell's got his audience today, so he'll be looking to make an impression. Have you thought about filing a formal complaint? What he's doing isn't right, and everyone knows it." Maria had thought about it many times, but she also knew how these things typically went. Mitchell was careful never to cross any obvious lines, and his harassment was subtle enough that it could be dismissed as tough leadership. The few women who had filed complaints in the past had found themselves transferred to different units or facing trumped-up disciplinary charges. "I just need to keep my head down and do my job," Maria said. "Eventually, either he'll move on to someone else, or I'll get transferred." But even as she said it, Maria knew she was tired of keeping her head down. She was tired of being treated like a second-class soldier, despite her exemplary record. She was tired of watching Mitchell treat male soldiers with respect while subjecting her to constant scrutiny and criticism. The walk to the training area took 15 minutes, giving Maria time to center herself and prepare mentally for whatever Mitchell had planned. The desert sun was already getting hot, and she could see heat waves rising from the asphalt as they approached the combat training facility. Colonel Harris was already present, along with 3 visiting officers that Maria didn't recognize. They stood in the shade of a temporary canopy, reviewing clipboards and discussing the day's exercises. Captain Mitchell was with them, pointing toward various training areas and explaining the planned activities with obvious enthusiasm. The battalion formed up in neat rows on the parade ground, 230 soldiers standing at attention in the morning heat. Maria took her position with her squad, maintaining perfect military bearing despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Today, we're going to demonstrate the combat readiness of the finest infantry soldiers in the United States Army," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying across the training ground. "You'll be participating in hand-to-hand combat exercises, tactical scenarios, and weapons proficiency demonstrations." He began walking along the rows of soldiers, occasionally stopping to inspect someone's uniform or equipment. When he reached Maria's row, he slowed his pace noticeably. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said loudly, ensuring that the visiting officers could hear. "Step forward." Maria's heart rate increased, but she stepped forward and snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." Mitchell circled her slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You've been with this unit for how long now?" 3 years, sir." 3 years, Mitchell repeated, making it sound like an accusation. "And in that time, you've participated in how many actual combat deployments?" Maria felt the trap being set, but she had no choice but to answer honestly. "None, sir. The unit hasn't been deployed during my time here." "None," Mitchell said, turning toward the visiting officers. "So your combat experience is limited to training exercises and simulations." "That's correct, sir." Mitchell nodded, as if this confirmed something important. "Today, you'll have the opportunity to demonstrate whether all that training has prepared you for real combat situations. You'll be participating in live combat exercises with some of our most experienced soldiers." Maria knew this was highly irregular. Combat training exercises were typically conducted between soldiers of similar rank and experience levels. Having a staff sergeant spar with senior officers or more experienced soldiers could be dangerous and serve no legitimate training purpose. But she also knew that refusing would be interpreted as weakness or insubordination, giving Mitchell the excuse he needed to discipline her formally. So she simply responded, "Yes, sir. I'm ready." "Outstanding," Mitchell said with a cold smile. "Report to the combat training ring in 10 minutes. You'll be demonstrating defensive techniques against multiple opponents." As Maria walked toward the designated training area, she could feel the weight of 3 years of harassment and discrimination settling on her shoulders. She thought about all the times she had swallowed her pride, ignored the snide comments, and accepted unfair treatment in the name of military discipline. The combat training ring was a circular area surrounded by sandbags and safety barriers, normally used for controlled sparring sessions. Today, it would serve as Mitchell's stage for his planned humiliation. Maria began stretching and preparing mentally for what was about to happen. Rodriguez appeared beside her, his face grim with concern. "This isn't right, Santos. That's not how training exercises are supposed to work." "I know," Maria replied quietly. "But if I refuse, he wins anyway. You don't have to prove anything to him or anyone else. Your record speaks for itself." Maria looked toward the observation area where Colonel Harris and the visiting officers were taking their seats. Mitchell was pointing in her direction and speaking animatedly about something. She realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every woman who had ever been told she wasn't strong enough, tough enough, or good enough to serve alongside men. "Actually, I do have something to prove," she said, removing her jacket and rolling up her sleeves. "I need to prove that I belong here, not just to them, but to myself." The whistle blew, signaling the beginning of the exercise. Maria walked to the center of the ring, her heart pounding, but her mind clear. Whatever Mitchell had planned, she was ready to face it head-on. She had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, even if she hadn't known it at the time. The combat training ring fell silent as Maria took her position in the center. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel sweat already forming under her tactical vest. Around the perimeter of the ring, her fellow soldiers formed a loose circle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Everyone sensed that something unusual was about to happen. Captain Mitchell stepped into the ring, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was dressed in full combat gear, including protective padding that seemed excessive for a routine training exercise. Behind him followed Sergeant Major Paul Hendricks, a 20-year veteran known for his aggressive fighting style, and Master Sergeant Kevin Burke, who had earned a reputation as one of the toughest hand-to-hand combat instructors on the base. Maria felt her stomach drop. This wasn't going to be a standard defensive training exercise. Mitchell had assembled what amounted to an assault team, 3 experienced fighters against 1 staff sergeant. The odds weren't just unfair. They were designed to ensure her failure and humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying across the training ground to where the visiting officers sat in the shade, "today we'll be conducting a realistic combat scenario. Staff Sergeant Santos will demonstrate defensive techniques against multiple attackers, simulating the kind of situation our soldiers might face in hostile territory." Colonel Harris leaned forward in his chair, his expression showing the first signs of concern. "Captain, what are the safety protocols for this exercise?" "Standard protective gear and controlled contact, sir," Mitchell replied smoothly. "This is a routine training evolution designed to test combat readiness under pressure." But Maria could see that nothing about this was routine. The 3 men surrounding her outweighed her by at least 50 pounds each, and their combined combat experience exceeded hers by decades. More importantly, she could see something in Mitchell's eyes that went beyond professional training. This was personal. Rodriguez stepped toward the edge of the ring. "Sir, request permission to participate as an observer to ensure proper safety protocols." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Permission denied, Sergeant. This exercise is specifically designed to test individual defensive capabilities without assistance." Maria understood the subtext. Mitchell wanted no witnesses who might interfere or later testify about what really happened in the ring. He had carefully orchestrated this scenario to appear legitimate, while giving himself maximum opportunity to inflict damage. The exercise will continue until Staff Sergeant Santos successfully neutralizes all 3 attackers or demonstrates an inability to continue, Mitchell explained to the observing officers. "This will give us valuable insight into the combat effectiveness of our personnel under realistic conditions." Maria had participated in hundreds of training exercises over her 3 years at Fort Braxton, but none had ever been structured this way. Typically, combat training involved one-on-one sparring with soldiers of similar size and experience with strict safety protocols and immediate intervention if anyone was injured. What Mitchell was proposing was essentially a sanctioned beating disguised as military training. She looked around the ring at the faces of her fellow soldiers. Some looked worried. Others appeared uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but none seemed willing to challenge their commanding officer's authority. Maria realized she was truly alone in this situation, facing not just 3 opponents, but the entire weight of a military hierarchy that had never fully accepted her presence. Sergeant Major Hendricks stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over Maria. At 6 feet 2 inches and 250 pounds, he was known for his ability to end sparring matches quickly and decisively. His face showed no emotion as he prepared for the exercise, treating it as just another day of training. "Remember," Mitchell said, ostensibly addressing all participants but looking directly at Maria, "this is about demonstrating real combat effectiveness. No holding back, no special consideration for anyone's feelings. In actual combat, the enemy won't care about your gender, your feelings, or your excuses." The reference to gender wasn't subtle, and everyone present understood the implication. Mitchell was making it clear that Maria's status as a woman would not protect her from whatever was about to happen. In fact, her gender seemed to be the very reason she had been selected for this demonstration. Master Sergeant Burke cracked his knuckles and began stretching his shoulders. He was shorter than Hendricks, but built like a tank with arms that looked like they could bend steel bars. His specialty was grappling and ground fighting techniques that relied on leverage and strength rather than speed and agility. Maria tried to calm her racing heart and focus on her training. She had earned her black belt in martial arts before joining the army and had continued practicing during her military service. She was fast, technically skilled, and had excellent endurance. But she also understood the reality of physics. In a straight fight against 3 larger, stronger opponents, technique could only compensate for so much. The whistle blew, signaling the start of the exercise. Hendricks moved first, charging forward with the confidence of someone who had never lost a training fight. His approach was straightforward and brutal, overwhelming force designed to end the confrontation quickly. Maria sidestepped his initial rush and delivered a quick strike to his ribs, but her blow bounced harmlessly off his protective padding. Before she could reset her position, Burke was on her from the left, attempting to grab her arm and drag her to the ground where his size advantage would be overwhelming. Maria twisted away from his grasp and created distance, but she was already breathing hard from the effort of avoiding 2 simultaneous attacks. Captain Mitchell circled the outside of the engagement like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He was the largest of the 3 men and clearly the most invested in the outcome of this confrontation. Maria could see the anticipation in his eyes as he watched her struggle against his subordinates. The crowd of soldiers around the ring had grown larger as word spread about the unusual training exercise. Maria could hear murmurs of concern and confusion, but no one was willing to challenge what was happening. The military hierarchy was absolute, and questioning a superior officer's training methods would be considered insubordination. Hendricks recovered from his mischarge and approached more cautiously this time. He and Burke began working together, trying to corner Maria against the ring boundary where she would have no room to maneuver. Their coordination was perfect, the result of years of training together and natural combat instincts. Maria found herself being forced backward, using every technique she had learned to avoid being trapped. She landed several strikes on both men, but their protective gear and superior size meant her attacks had little effect. Meanwhile, every block and evasion was draining her energy while her opponents remained fresh. Captain Mitchell chose this moment to enter the fight, attacking from Maria's blind side while she was focused on the other 2 men. His first blow caught her shoulder, spinning her around and disrupting her defensive stance. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through her entire body, and she realized that Mitchell wasn't just participating in the exercise. He was trying to hurt her. The 3 men closed in simultaneously, their coordinated attack designed to overwhelm any possible defense. Maria found herself fighting for survival rather than trying to win a training exercise. She used every technique in her arsenal, striking pressure points, attempting joint locks, and using her superior speed to avoid the worst of their attacks. But the outcome was inevitable. Against one opponent, even a larger one, Maria's skill and training might have been enough. Against two, she could have probably held her own. Against three experienced fighters working together, including one who seemed determined to cause serious injury, she was fighting a losing battle. A powerful blow from Burke caught her in the stomach, doubling her over and leaving her vulnerable to Hendrick's follow-up attack. His elbow strike was aimed at her head, but Maria managed to get her arms up just in time. The impact still rattled her brain and sent her stumbling backward. Captain Mitchell moved in for what appeared to be the finishing sequence, his face showing satisfaction at Maria's obvious distress. But as he reached for her, something changed in Maria's expression. The fear and uncertainty were replaced by a cold, focused determination that seemed to surprise even her attackers. She had spent 3 years accepting unfair treatment, swallowing her pride, and trying to prove herself according to someone else's standards. In that moment, with 3 men trying to break her spirit in front of an audience, Maria Santos decided she was done being a victim. The shift in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her stance changed, her breathing steadied, and her eyes locked on Captain Mitchell with an intensity that made him hesitate for just a fraction of a second. That hesitation would prove to be the most important moment of his military career. Rodriguez, watching from the sideline, later described it as seeing a completely different person emerge from inside Maria Santos. Gone was the careful, rule-following soldier who had tried so hard to fit in. In her place stood a warrior who had finally decided to fight back. The crowd around the ring sensed the change too, their murmurs dying away as everyone focused on what was about to happen. Even Colonel Harris leaned forward, his practiced eye recognizing that the dynamic in the ring had fundamentally shifted. Captain Mitchell, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, decided to end the exercise with overwhelming force. He launched himself toward Maria with his full weight and strength, intending to drive her to the ground and claim victory in front of his audience. But Maria Santos was no longer the same person who had stepped into the ring 10 minutes earlier. She had finally stopped trying to prove she belonged and started fighting like someone who knew she did. The collision that followed would be talked about at Fort Braxton for years to come. Time seemed to slow as Captain Mitchell launched himself toward Maria with the full force of his 230 pounds. His approach was wild and angry, abandoning the controlled techniques of military combat training for something more primal. This was no longer about demonstrating combat readiness or testing defensive capabilities. This had become personal, and everyone watching could see it. Maria Santos, however, was no longer the same person who had entered the ring. The careful, rule-following soldier who had spent 3 years trying to prove she belonged had been replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. As Mitchell charged toward her, Maria didn't retreat or attempt to evade. Instead, she planted her feet and prepared to meet his attack head-on. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed by military instructors for years to come. As Mitchell reached for her, Maria executed a perfect counter-movement that used his own momentum and weight against him. She grabbed his extended arm, pivoted on her left foot, and threw her entire body into a leverage throw that sent the much larger man flying through the air. The technique itself wasn't particularly unusual. It was a standard judo throw that Maria had practiced thousands of times. What made it remarkable was the precision of its execution under extreme pressure and the devastating effect it had on Captain Mitchell's body when he hit the ground. Mitchell landed hard on his left leg, which was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath his body weight. The sound of breaking bone was audible throughout the training area, a sharp crack that cut through the desert air like a gunshot. His scream of pain followed immediately, a sound that made everyone watching realize that this was no longer a training exercise. The ring fell silent except for Mitchell's agonized groans. He lay on the ground, clutching his leg, his face pale with shock and pain. The break was severe. His left tibia had snapped completely, with fragments of bone visible through the fabric of his uniform pants. Maria stood over him, breathing heavily, but showing no signs of remorse or concern. For a moment, she simply stared down at the man who had made her life miserable for 3 years, watching him writhe in pain at her feet. The power dynamic between them had shifted completely in the span of a few seconds. Sergeant Major Hendricks and Master Sergeant Burke stood frozen, unsure how to react to the sudden turn of events. They had expected to participate in the systematic humiliation of a female soldier. Instead, they were witnessing their commanding officer being defeated by the very person he had tried to break. Colonel Harris was the first to react, jumping from his chair and shouting for medical assistance. "Medic! Get a medic over here now!" His voice carried across the training ground with military authority, breaking the spell that had fallen over the assembled soldiers. The base medical team, who had been standing by for routine training injuries, rushed into the ring with stretchers and emergency equipment. They quickly assessed Mitchell's condition and began preparing him for transport to the base hospital. The break was severe enough that it would require immediate surgery and months of rehabilitation. As the medics worked, Maria remained standing in the center of the ring, her chest rising and falling with controlled breathing. She showed no emotion as they loaded Mitchell onto a stretcher, his face contorted with pain and his uniform soaked with sweat. When he was finally carried away, she simply turned and walked toward the edge of the ring. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Colonel Harris called out, his voice sharp with authority. "Remain where you are." Maria stopped and turned to face the colonel, snapping to attention despite the circumstances. Her uniform was disheveled, and she had minor cuts and bruises from the fight, but her bearing remained military and professional. "Sir," she responded crisply. Colonel Harris approached the ring, followed by the visiting officers who were trying to process what they had just witnessed. The planned demonstration of combat readiness had turned into something entirely different, a confrontation that revealed serious problems within the unit's command structure. "What exactly happened here, Staff Sergeant?" the colonel asked, his tone carefully neutral. Maria considered her response carefully. She could minimize what had occurred, claim that Mitchell's injury was an accident during routine training. That would be the safe choice, the one that wouldn't create waves or challenge the established order. But Maria Santos was done being safe. "Sir, Captain Mitchell set up what he called a defensive training exercise. 3 senior soldiers against 1 staff sergeant, with instructions to demonstrate real combat effectiveness without holding back. I defended myself using appropriate techniques, and Captain Mitchell was injured when his attack failed." The colonel's expression darkened as he processed the implications of Maria's statement. A training exercise that pitted 3 experienced fighters against 1 soldier was highly irregular and potentially dangerous. The fact that it had been specifically designed to target a female soldier made it even more problematic. Were proper safety protocols followed? Colonel Harris asked, though he already suspected the answer. "No, sir," Maria replied without hesitation. The exercise was not conducted according to standard training procedures. No safety officer was designated. No medical personnel were informed of the high-risk nature of the exercise, and the participants were not properly matched for size and experience. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of soldiers who were still gathered around the ring. Maria's formal response had essentially accused Captain Mitchell of conducting unauthorized and dangerous training that violated multiple military regulations. Rodriguez stepped forward from the crowd, his expression grim but determined. "Colonel, I request permission to speak." Harris nodded. "Go ahead, Sergeant." "Sir, this wasn't the first time Captain Mitchell had singled out Staff Sergeant Santos for unusual treatment. There have been numerous incidents over the past 3 years where she was subjected to different standards and excessive scrutiny." Other soldiers began stepping forward as well, emboldened by Rodriguez's courage to speak up. One by one, they began describing incidents they had witnessed. Times when Mitchell had assigned Maria to dangerous duties alone, given her impossible tasks designed to ensure failure, or subjected her to verbal harassment disguised as military discipline. The picture that emerged was of a commanding officer who had waged a systematic campaign of harassment against a subordinate, culminating in today's dangerous and unauthorized training exercise. The visiting officers took notes, while Colonel Harris listened with growing anger and concern. "Staff Sergeant Santos," the colonel said finally, "you will report to my office at 1400 hours for a complete debriefing. Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you there as well, along with any other soldiers who have relevant information about these incidents." Maria nodded. "Yes, sir. In the meantime, you are relieved of all duties pending a full investigation." "This is not a disciplinary action," Harris added quickly. It's for your own protection while we sort out what happened here. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria finally allowed herself to feel the full impact of what had just occurred. She had broken her commanding officer's leg in front of witnesses, ending his military career and probably his ability to walk normally. More importantly, she had finally stood up for herself after years of accepting unfair treatment. Lisa Chan appeared at her side, having rushed over from the communications center when word of the incident spread across the base. "Maria, are you okay?" "I think so," Maria replied, though she wasn't entirely sure. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by a complex mix of relief, fear, and uncertainty about what would happen next. "You did the right thing," Chin said firmly. "Everyone knows Mitchell had it coming." But Maria wasn't thinking about right or wrong anymore. She was thinking about the moment when Mitchell had charged at her with clear intent to cause harm, and how her body had reacted with techniques that had been drilled into her through years of training. She had used exactly enough force to stop his attack and protect herself, but the result had been devastating. The base hospital would later confirm that Mitchell had suffered a compound fracture of his left tibia, requiring multiple surgeries and extensive physical therapy. His military career was effectively over, not just because of the injury, but because of the investigation that would inevitably follow. Maria spent the rest of the day giving statements to military investigators, describing in detail the pattern of harassment she had endured and the events that led to the confrontation in the training ring. Her fellow soldiers corroborated her account, providing testimony that painted a clear picture of an officer who had abused his authority. That evening, as Maria sat in her barracks reviewing the day's events, she realized that her life at Fort Braxton would never be the same. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, standing up to authority in a way that would have consequences far beyond a single training exercise. But for the first time in 3 years, Maria Santos felt like she could breathe freely. She had finally stopped trying to prove she belonged and started acting like someone who knew she did. The price had been high, but the alternative, continuing to accept abuse and harassment, had become unacceptable. The real battle, she knew, was just beginning. The investigation began within hours of Captain Mitchell's injury. By the time Maria reported to Colonel Harris's office that afternoon, a team of military investigators from Fort Braxton's Inspector General office had already established a command post in the administration building. The seriousness of the situation was evident in their rapid response and the thoroughness of their initial inquiries. Maria stood at attention in front of Colonel Harris's desk, flanked by Rodriguez and 3 other soldiers who had witnessed the training incident. The visiting officers from that morning were also present, along with Major Patricia Weston from the Inspector General's office, a sharp-eyed woman with 20 years of experience investigating military misconduct. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Major Weston began, "I want you to understand that this investigation has 2 separate but related components. First, we need to determine whether the training exercise that resulted in Captain Mitchell's injury was conducted according to proper military procedures. Second, we need to investigate allegations of harassment and discrimination that may have contributed to the events of this morning." Maria nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. Let's start with this morning's incident. Tell me exactly what happened from the moment you arrived at the training area." Maria recounted the events in precise detail, describing Mitchell's selection of opponents, the unusual structure of the exercise, and the apparent intent to cause her harm rather than conduct legitimate training. Her account was methodical and professional, sticking to observable facts rather than speculation about Mitchell's motives. Major Weston took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific technical aspects of the combat training. "When Captain Mitchell made his final attack, did you perceive it as an immediate threat to your safety?" "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied without hesitation. His approach was wild and uncontrolled, outside the parameters of any training exercise I had ever participated in. He was attempting to cause serious injury, not demonstrate combat techniques. "And your response?" "I used appropriate defensive techniques to neutralize the threat. The throw I executed is a standard technique taught in military combat training." Captain Mitchell's injury resulted from his own momentum and the force of his attack. Rodriguez was called to testify next, providing his perspective as a senior enlisted soldier who had observed the incident from outside the ring. His account corroborated Maria's description of events, while adding important context about Mitchell's behavior leading up to the confrontation. "Sir, in my 15 years of military service, I have never seen a training exercise structured like the one Captain Mitchell designed this morning," Rodriguez told the investigators. "It violated every safety protocol we have and appeared designed to ensure Staff Sergeant Santos would be injured." The other witnesses provided similar testimony, describing Mitchell's unusual demeanor, the excessive force used during the exercise, and the clear targeting of Maria for special treatment. Their accounts painted a consistent picture of an officer who had used his authority to conduct what amounted to a sanctioned assault. Major Weston then shifted to the broader pattern of harassment that had allegedly preceded the morning's incident. "Staff Sergeant Santos, you've indicated that this morning's training exercise was not an isolated incident. Can you describe the pattern of treatment you received from Captain Mitchell?" This was the moment Maria had been both anticipating and dreading. For 3 years, she had documented incidents in her personal journal, but had never formally reported them. Now she had the opportunity to tell her story to investigators who had the authority to take action, but she also knew that doing so would make her allegations public and potentially end Mitchell's career even if he recovered from his injuries. Maria took a deep breath and began describing the systematic harassment she had endured. The impossible assignments designed to ensure failure. The public humiliation disguised as military discipline. The different standard applied to her compared to male soldiers of equivalent rank and experience. "Captain Mitchell would frequently assign me to solo duties that were normally performed by 2-person teams," Maria explained. "When I completed these assignments successfully, he would criticize minor details that he ignored when male soldiers made similar mistakes. When I struggled with assignments that were inherently difficult to complete alone, he would use that as evidence that I wasn't qualified for infantry duty." She described incidents where Mitchell had questioned her physical fitness despite her consistently high scores on all military fitness tests. Times when he had excluded her from important briefings or training opportunities. Occasions when he had made disparaging comments about women in combat roles while looking directly at her. "Did you ever consider filing a formal complaint?" Major Weston asked. "Yes, ma'am, many times, but I was concerned about retaliation and the impact it might have on my career. I also hoped that if I continued to perform at a high standard, the harassment would eventually stop." Rodriguez and the other witnesses confirmed Maria's account, providing specific examples of differential treatment they had observed. Their testimony revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond tough military leadership into the realm of targeted harassment based on gender. The investigation continued for 3 days, with investigators interviewing dozens of soldiers, reviewing training records, and examining the procedures that had led to Mitchell's injury. They also interviewed personnel at the base hospital who had treated Mitchell, gathering medical evidence about the nature and extent of his injuries. The medical report was damning in its own way. Dr. Sarah Kim, the orthopedic surgeon who had operated on Mitchell's leg, testified that his injuries were consistent with a defensive throw rather than an unprovoked attack. The angle and location of the break indicated that he had been moving forward with significant momentum when he was thrown, supporting Maria's account of the incident. The injury pattern suggests that Captain Mitchell was the aggressor in this confrontation, Dr. Kim explained to the investigators. "If Staff Sergeant Santos had been the attacking party, we would expect to see different types of injuries consistent with an offensive assault." Meanwhile, news of the incident had spread beyond Fort Braxton. Military justice advocates and women's rights organizations began taking interest in the case, recognizing it as a potential landmark in the ongoing struggle for equal treatment of women in combat roles. Media outlets requested information about the investigation, though military officials maintained strict confidentiality during the ongoing proceedings. Captain Mitchell, confined to a hospital bed and facing multiple surgeries, initially tried to characterize the incident as an unprovoked attack by a subordinate soldier. However, his version of events quickly fell apart under scrutiny from investigators who had collected testimony from multiple witnesses. His claim that the training exercise had been conducted according to standard procedures was contradicted by every military manual and regulation governing combat training. His assertion that Maria had attacked him without provocation was contradicted by witnesses who had seen him charge at her with obvious intent to cause harm. More damaging to his case were the testimonies of soldiers who described his pattern of harassment toward Maria. Several soldiers came forward with information about previous incidents they had witnessed, but never reported, fearing retaliation from their commanding officer. Private Johnson, the young soldier who had been at Maria's breakfast table the morning of the incident, provided particularly compelling testimony. He described overhearing Mitchell tell other officers that he was going to show that woman her place, and that female soldiers needed to be reminded of their limitations. On the fourth day of the investigation, Major Weston called Maria back for a final interview. The tone was markedly different from their initial meeting, with the investigator treating Maria more like a victim than a potential perpetrator. Staff Sergeant Santos, based on our investigation, it's clear that you were the victim of systematic harassment and that you acted in self-defense during the training incident. Captain Mitchell's injuries were the result of his own aggressive actions and your appropriate defensive response. Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by uncertainty about what would happen next. What does this mean for my military career, ma'am? You will be cleared of any wrongdoing in this incident. In fact, your restraint and professionalism throughout this ordeal have been exemplary. You had grounds to file formal complaints against Captain Mitchell months or years ago, but you chose to focus on your military duties instead. Major Weston paused before continuing. However, I need to be honest with you about the challenges you may face going forward. You've made some powerful enemies by standing up for yourself, and there may be officers who view your actions as insubordination regardless of the investigation's findings. Maria had expected this. Military culture, despite official policies promoting equality, often punished those who challenged authority even when they were completely justified in doing so. Her victory in the investigation might be Pyrrhic if it resulted in her being ostracized or pushed out of the service. There is another option, Major Weston said carefully. Given the circumstances of this case, and your exemplary service record, you would be eligible for a transfer to a different unit where you could start fresh. You might also consider officer candidate school. Your leadership skills and courage under pressure would make you an excellent officer. Maria considered the options. She could stay at Fort Braxton and face the consequences of her actions, potentially dealing with subtle retaliation and a hostile work environment. She could transfer to another unit and hope for better treatment. Or she could pursue advancement through officer training and use her experience to help other soldiers facing similar challenges. I need some time to think about it, Maria said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. Just remember that what happened here wasn't your fault, and you shouldn't let anyone make you feel otherwise. As Maria walked out of Colonel Harris's office that evening, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. She had been vindicated by the investigation and cleared of any wrongdoing, but she also knew that her life in the military would never be the same. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, challenging authority in a way that would follow her for the rest of her career. But for the first time in 3 years, Maria Santos felt like she had control over her own destiny. She had stopped being a victim and started being a soldier who knew her worth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them on her own terms. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Maria Santos stood in front of a mirror in her new quarters at Fort Carson, Colorado, adjusting the gold bars on her uniform collar. The officer candidate school graduation ceremony was scheduled for the next morning, and she would officially become Second Lieutenant Maria Santos, one of the youngest Hispanic female officers in the infantry. The journey from that fateful training exercise at Fort Braxton to this moment had been anything but simple. The weeks following the investigation had been filled with difficult decisions, unexpected opportunities, and the gradual realization that standing up for herself had opened doors she never knew existed. Captain Derek Mitchell had been quietly forced into medical retirement following his recovery from surgery. The investigation had revealed not only his harassment of Maria, but also similar behavior toward other female soldiers during his previous assignments. His military career was over, his pension reduced, and his reputation permanently tarnished. The injury to his leg had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp that served as a daily reminder of his failed attempt to break Maria's spirit. The official report from the investigation had been scathing in its criticism of Mitchell's leadership and the command climate he had created. Colonel Harris, who had been unaware of the extent of the harassment, had implemented sweeping changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. New protocols were established for combat training exercises, mandatory training on harassment prevention was instituted, and a confidential reporting system was created for soldiers experiencing discrimination. For Maria, the vindication had come with a price. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing, she had become a controversial figure within certain circles of the military. Some officers viewed her as a troublemaker who had used violence against a superior officer, regardless of the circumstances. Others saw her as a symbol of the changing military and the challenges that came with integrating women into combat roles. The decision to leave Fort Braxton had been difficult, but necessary. While Colonel Harris had offered to let her stay and had promised protection from retaliation, Maria realized that remaining would mean dealing with the aftermath of the incident for years to come. Every training exercise, every evaluation, every interaction with fellow soldiers would be shadowed by what had happened in that ring. Major Weston had been instrumental in helping Maria navigate her options. The investigator had become something of a mentor, using her extensive network within the military to identify opportunities for Maria to advance her career while escaping the negative atmosphere of Fort Braxton. "You have a choice," Major Weston had told her during one of their final meetings. "You can stay here and fight the same battles over and over again, or you can take your experience and use it to create change from a position of greater authority." The idea of officer candidate school had initially seemed impossible. Maria had never considered herself officer material, focusing instead on excelling as an enlisted soldier. But Major Weston had convinced her that her leadership skills, demonstrated courage, and first-hand experience with the challenges facing female soldiers made her exactly the kind of officer the military needed. The application process had been intense, requiring recommendations from senior officers, psychological evaluations, and extensive interviews about her career goals and motivations. The incident with Captain Mitchell had actually worked in her favor, demonstrating her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure and make difficult decisions in challenging circumstances. Officer Candidate School itself had been the most demanding experience of Maria's military career. The academic coursework was rigorous, covering everything from military history and tactics to leadership psychology and international relations. The physical training was designed to push candidates to their absolute limits, testing not just their fitness, but their ability to lead others through difficult situations. But Maria had thrived in the environment. Her experience as an enlisted soldier gave her credibility with her classmates, many of whom were college graduates with no prior military experience. Her first-hand knowledge of the challenges facing soldiers in the field made her a natural leader during training exercises. Most importantly, her experience with adversity had given her a mental toughness that served her well during the most challenging aspects of the program. The other candidates in her class had initially been curious about the story behind her attendance at Officer Candidate School. Word had spread through the military grapevine about the incident at Fort Braxton, though the details were often distorted in the telling. Some versions painted Maria as an aggressive soldier who had attacked her commanding officer. Others portrayed her as a victim who had been forced to defend herself against an abusive superior. Maria had chosen to address the rumors directly, giving her classmates a straightforward account of what had happened and why she had decided to pursue a commission. Her honesty and transparency had earned the respect of her fellow candidates and helped dispel some of the more sensational rumors about her past. The academic portion of officer training had included extensive coursework on leadership, ethics, and military justice. Maria found herself drawing on her experiences at Fort Braxton to contribute to class discussions about command climate, harassment prevention, and the responsibilities of military leaders. Her professors recognized her unique perspective and encouraged her to consider specializing in personnel management or military justice after receiving her commission. One of the most meaningful aspects of the program had been the mentorship she received from female officers who had faced similar challenges during their own careers. Colonel Janet Morrison, the commandant of the Officer Candidate School, had taken a particular interest in Maria's development, sharing stories about her own struggles to be accepted as a female officer in the 1990s. "The military has come a long way since I was a lieutenant," Colonel Morrison had told Maria during one of their mentoring sessions. "But there's still work to be done. We need officers who understand these challenges from personal experience and are committed to creating a better environment for future generations of soldiers." The physical training component of Officer Candidate School had been less challenging for Maria than for many of her classmates, thanks to her years of maintaining peak fitness as an infantry soldier. However, the leadership exercises had pushed her in new ways, requiring her to direct and motivate others rather than simply excel individually. During field exercises, Maria had demonstrated a natural ability to inspire confidence in her subordinates while making sound tactical decisions under pressure. Her instructors noted her exceptional situational awareness and her ability to remain calm during chaotic scenarios. The skills she had developed during 3 years of proving herself at Fort Braxton served her well as she prepared to lead other soldiers. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning, with families and friends invited to witness the commissioning of 32 new officers. Maria's parents had flown in from Texas, proud of their daughter's achievement, but still struggling to understand the events that had led to this moment. Her father, a construction worker who had served briefly in the National Guard, was particularly moved by the idea of his daughter becoming an officer. Lisa Chun had also made the trip from Fort Braxton, having requested leave specifically to attend Maria's graduation. Their friendship had deepened during the difficult months following the investigation, which in serving as a sounding board for Maria's decisions and a source of emotional support during challenging times. Rodriguez, now serving as a platoon sergeant at Fort Braxton, had sent a congratulatory message along with a small gift, a framed photograph of Maria's old squad taken during a training exercise before the incident with Captain Mitchell. The inscription read, "To the best soldier I ever served with. Your courage changed all of us." As Maria prepared for bed on the eve of her graduation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The scared, angry staff sergeant who had stepped into that training ring 6 months ago felt like a different person. The experience of standing up to Captain Mitchell had fundamentally changed how she saw herself and her place in the military. She no longer felt the need to prove she belonged. She no longer accepted unfair treatment in the name of military discipline. Most importantly, she no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She had learned that she possessed the strength and courage to change situations that were unacceptable, even when doing so required significant personal risk. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Major Weston was calling to offer congratulations before the ceremony and to discuss Maria's next assignment. She had been selected for a position as a platoon leader in an infantry unit at Fort Hood, Texas, where she would be responsible for leading 30 soldiers in training and potential combat operations. "Are you ready for this?" Major Weston asked. "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied without hesitation. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm ready to take on the responsibility. You've already proven that you can handle difficult situations with grace and professionalism. Your soldiers are going to be lucky to have you as their leader." After ending the call, Maria walked to her window and looked out at the Colorado mountains silhouetted against the evening sky. Tomorrow would mark the official beginning of a new chapter in her military career, but in many ways, that chapter had already begun 6 months ago when she decided to stop being a victim and start being a soldier who knew her worth. The incident at Fort Braxton had cost Captain Mitchell his career and changed the culture of an entire military unit. It had also transformed Maria Santos from a staff sergeant struggling to prove she belonged into a commissioned officer ready to lead others with confidence and integrity. As she prepared for sleep on the eve of her graduation, Maria smiled at the thought of the young soldiers she would soon be leading. Some of them would undoubtedly face challenges similar to those she had experienced. When they did, they would have a leader who understood their struggles from personal experience and was committed to ensuring they never had to face them alone. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning.